Well, I'm so glad all of you are here, but I have some bad news to tell you. Easter has been canceled because it conflicts with April Fool's Day. April Fools. Now, see, this is a big deal for us preachers because these 2 days, April Fool's and Easter, fall on the same day this year. It's April 1st, if you haven't checked your calendar. And that's a big deal because the last time Easter fell on April Fool's Day was way back in 1956, 2 whole eon years before I was born. That's not a joke, by the way. And it won't happen again for another 11 years, 2029. And by which time I'm going to be retired or I'll be too tired to do anything about it. So I figured that today we needed to take advantage of it being Easter and April Fools and have a lot of fun on this day. So here are some great ways for us to celebrate Easter and April Fools together. The first thing that we can do is we can go to Burger King right after church and you can order a flame-grilled chocolate patty. Believe it or not, this is a photo from Burger King's actual April Fool's joke advertisement. Yum, yum. Or, when you go home today, have your kids go out and look for Easter eggs that you haven't hidden. Or those that you have hidden, those little plastic eggs, instead of candy being inside them, put vegetables. Oh, look, you got the asparagus. Or you can unwrap some of those little foil-wrapped chocolate eggs and secretly replace the chocolate with a grape or a piece of rock. And then wrap it back up and put it in the egg. Okay. If you're looking for some fun at dinner time, you can unscrew just to the point where it's almost ready to come off your salt and pepper shakers. And then watch with amusement as the first person goes to put it on their plate. Oh, that's so much fun. The cook always loves that. Or you can put sugar in the salt bowl, or salt in the sugar bowl on your table. And watch what happens when they put sugar in their coffee. Make sure that your linens are washable. Or you can get one of those hollow chocolate bunnies. I actually saw this on the internet of an idea. And fill it with mustard. Yum, yum, yum. And I'm sure there are all kinds of other things that you can Google today. By the way, did you know that I saw the Easter Bunny this morning was in timeout? Do you know why the Easter Bunny was in timeout? He was having a bad hair day. Like I said, you won't have to put up with this for another 11 years, so... You know, if you read Mark's gospel story, you would think that he was telling us a bad April Fool's joke. Here you've come to see the risen Jesus, and Mark tells us, I'm sorry he's not here. And you got all dressed up and everything. And then just when the women are given instructions about where they can go find him and how others can find him too, they leave the cemetery and they don't say a word. And if they had nothing to say, then neither do I. Glad you came. Thanks. Happy Easter. April Fools. Because you knew that wasn't going to happen, right? If all we had was Mark's version of the resurrection, you'd have to wonder if he was playing a joke. This is it? No Jesus? No good news message about him being alive again? You've got to be kidding. I mean, this is no way to run a resurrection. What kind of Easter story is this? And I would guess that the women who came to the tomb that morning had their own sets of questions. They'd come to pay their last respects to Jesus at the grave. We do that. You and I have done that when we've lost a loved one. We go back to the cemetery to see the grave again. We lay some more flowers at the site. We tell a couple more stories because we just can't quite let go of our loved ones. And as much as we wish they'd come back, we know better than to expect it. So the last thing the women expect on the first day of the week is for the grave to be empty and some stranger telling them that the dead loved one they seek is alive. It sounds like a cruel April Fool's joke than something worth believing, something worth getting excited about, because they know, you know, we all know that dead people do not live again, period. End of story. It's just not possible, at least not in this life, maybe in some other life, but it can't happen here. It won't happen here. It is really hard to get a dead man to live again. All you have to do is ask Relu Constantine. The Associated Press 2 weeks ago carried this story about Mr. Constantine, who had just received the bad news that a Romanian court had rejected his claim that he was alive after his former wife had declared him dead 5 years ago. Now that's what I call a bitter divorce. It seems that he had been working in Turkey as a cook for the past 20 years. Then he returned to his home country of Romania, only to discover that his ex-wife had officially had him registered as dead. And upon landing at the Bucharest airport, he was informed by border officials that he, evidence to the contrary, was actually dead. He underwent 6 hours of questioning and tests with local officials, which would have been enough to kill him if he hadn't already been dead. They asked him questions about his hometown, such as, where's the town hall? They checked his fingerprints. They even measured the distance between his eyes to see if it corresponded to an old passport photograph. They decided it was me, he said. But the court refused to overturn his death certificate because the request was filed too late. You see, that is really one of the problems with being dead. You lose all sense of time. So if a man who is alive can't convince people he's not dead, what chance does a really dead man have in convincing you he's alive? The last thing these 3 women who come to the cemetery in the dim light of Sunday morning expect is to find a living Jesus. Because they had stood near the cross and held their breath when he breathed his last. And they had watched through tear-filled eyes as Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' limp body down from the cross and wrapped it in a long linen cloth. And then they had plodded along behind Joseph to the cemetery and sobbed as he tenderly placed Jesus' battered body in a tomb and rolled the large stone across the entrance. Because the Sabbath day of rest was about to begin that Friday evening, there had been no time to prepare the usual burial spices. So early on Sunday morning, these 3 women had come to perform one last act of kindness. And perhaps one last time hold his lifeless hand before they left Jerusalem and returned to Galilee, where they had first met him, and where they would try to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. But as soon as they drew near to the grave, they could tell something was not right. They had just been talking about who could move the great stone to let them inside the tomb, and now as they made their way through the pale light of the early morning, they could see in the inky blackness of the tomb's opening that had been left exposed when the stone had been rolled away. They crept closer, only to discover someone sitting inside. Mark tells us in first breath that it's a young man. In the second breath, he says it's an angel. And then the words this person speaks sound so fantastic for them to believe. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene. He was crucified, and that much they already knew. That was one of the certainties they had. But the next words left them trembling with fear and amazement, disbelief and wonder. He's not here. He has been raised. And not only raised, he's on the move. He's already ahead of you. He's somewhere in Galilee by now, on his way back to the place where it all began. So they were told to go and find the others, give them that message, and the women run so full of fear that they cannot even say a word about it to anyone, says Mark. And perhaps we could understand their silence, because if we were to hear news like that firsthand, if we were to see what they saw and know that God had somehow overcome the awfulness of what had happened, then we might be at a loss for words too. For they had left with a hope greater than any of us would probably have words to speak it. But of course, at some point they did tell. That's why we're here. They told each other first, just to make sure, did we really hear what we heard? And then they told it to the disciples. And then the disciples joined them in telling others until at last someone told us. Like Paul, born out of time. And didn't just tell us, but they helped us see Christ, experience Christ alive for ourselves. Even now we may not yet have found the words for it ourselves, but we came to believe that the story was true, really true. Because we also discovered the risen Christ was somehow ahead of us in the place where we now live. We found him for ourselves, and we can now tell how he came to us in the moment we most needed him. How he surprised us one day with strength when we were weak, with forgiveness when we had failed. How he gave us hope when we were in despair, and how he offered us purpose and direction when we had lost our way. In 100 other ways, we can tell the story of how he was ahead of us. Amid all of the dead ends, when the only thing we were certain of was that nothing left would be believable. Jesus, the April fool, surprised us and reminded us that there is nothing so certain that the love of God cannot find a way to break in and bring us what we least expected. That's what a good April Fool's joke does. It's supposed to break up our routine, to throw off our certainties, to challenge everything that we think we know so well, and to give us something unexpected. The best time to plant bulbs is probably December. But because of my day job, that tends to be a rather busy month. And the last thing I'm interested in doing in December, or any other month of the year for that matter, is yard work. But last fall, Vicki bought some bulbs. And they languished in our garage until about 3 weeks ago. And we took them out in the front yard and buried them, not expecting them to do much. It was really more like giving them a proper burial. But yesterday she noticed that there were signs of life poking through their little graves. And it made me think of my mother, who was an extraordinary gardener. And I can recall seeing her many times planting bulbs in the dead of fall, when everything around her was dying. And in some way, even perhaps before she could understand it herself, she was patiently plotting the resurrection. And every spring, her yard would burst into color, and something would come alive in my mother as well. Maybe that's what Mark has done in ending his gospel in this odd way. He's plotting the resurrection for us. Because if Mark just hands us the risen Jesus, then we might mistakenly believe that Easter is some event that happened long ago. But instead, the angel's message is not he was raised, but it's he has been raised and is risen. Which means resurrection isn't behind us somewhere, but it's ahead of us. It's where Jesus is. First in Galilee and then somewhere else. And lo and behold, he's here in Cartersville today, but he's always ahead of us, plotting the resurrection for us. And that means you and I are just as likely to meet him as the women did. We might not even recognize him at first, but we'll bump into the risen Jesus stumbling toward us on broken feet, extending his wounded hands toward us and speaking words that we need to hear. I'm with you, always. Like those women, there is so much in our world that will leave us speechless, unable to find a word of hope for the pain and the heartache that we have seen. But we don't have to leave those places full of fear For the risen Christ is ahead of us, and we no longer have to fear that we will head into a place or into a situation where Jesus will not already be waiting for us, where he will not share his presence and his strength with us. He will forever be the April Fool, giving us what we least expect when we most need it, finding a way to break into our lives and turn them upside down, or if need be, to turn them right side up. And that's when we'll understand why we don't need the women to tell their story, because we'll have one of our own. The words of resurrection will be on our lips, because the presence of Christ will be in our heart. And that's no joke. May it be so for you. May it be so for all of us. Amen.